So hello everyone, my name is Pat Lurcock. I'm setting up this Zoom meeting for everyone to hear a bit about Bruce. So this is the South Georgia Association's online talk by Bruce Mair about, well, I'll let him tell you what it's all about. But we're from the South Georgia Association, which was set up just over 20 years ago to give a voice to people who want to have a bit of a say, be a bit of a constituency for South Georgia, and so we can share all our interests and learn from each other. And if there are anyone here who's not a member, who hasn't joined yet, please do feel free to dive off to our website a bit later on or tomorrow and join. But in the meantime, I'll hand you over to Bruce and let him tell you all about the subject of the evening. Over to you, Bruce.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Pat, for introducing me. You know from the title that we're talking about Cook's Landing in 1775, and I'll also share with you my 2 anniversaries for Cook's Landing when I was on the island itself. Now, I'm sure many of you know where the island is, but I'll just really refresh everyone. It's in the South Atlantic. It's about 170 kilometers long, between 2 and 40 kilometers wide, and the highest point is Mount Paget at 2,960 meters. Now, my talk tonight, I'll talk about James Cook, and only briefly. I didn't realize until I started studying James Cook that it is a Pandora's box of information. And I could talk for weeks about James Cook, all the work that's been done by people before me. But I'll concentrate on aspects of the second voyage, which is the one where he found and landed on South Georgia. We'll then make the transition from charts to maps, where we go from Cook's chart to modern day maps, and then my landing anniversaries, the 200th and the 202nd. And then we'll look at South Georgia 250 years on. Now, it just so happens that Whitby Abbey, which is in a town that Cook spent a lot of time in, is at 54 degrees north. It just so happens King Edward Point, the British Antarctic Survey headquarters on the island, is at 54 degrees south. So you think, well, we know what Yorkshire's like, so we know what South Georgia is going to be like. And here's sunny Yorkshire. The sun always shines in Yorkshire, I'd like to believe. This is a little hill called Rosebery Topping, where Cook is reported to have spent quite a lot of time because he lived nearby in the village of Great Ayton. Here we are, 54 degrees north. But if you go to 54 degrees south, it's a slightly different climate. This is Drygalski Fjord in the southern end of our island, with the Wisting Glacier coming in from the south. Sorry, south in the picture, northwest in this picture. And you can see the important thing about South Georgia is the ice and snow come down to the sea. There has to be a big continent of ice near it, which is one of what Cook was out to try and find. Now, Cook, his father was called James Cook. He was a farm labourer. He was actually Scottish, which I will actually fly the flag for that to say good. He came from good stock. His mother was Grace Pace, and he was born 27th of October 1728 in a small village called Martin in Cleveland, just near Middlesbrough. As with many families at the time, it was difficult for young children to survive, and Cook was only the second of 8, and one of only 3 to survive over the age of 21. 1736, they moved to the little village of Great Ayton, just 5 miles away. He wasn't going far. And that is from where he went to school. He was brought up and learned to make his way around the hills of the North York Moors. And then in 1745, he was moving further afield now. He's gone 20 miles away to States on the coast. And just a year later, became an apprentice to a merchant in Whitby, from where he was then going to start his merchant marine experience. He'd now travelled to up to 30 miles from home. And then for the next 9 years, as a seaman, he made 15 return voyages on colliers from Tyneside to London and to Europe. It's almost as though he's jumped exponentially in distance from where he started. And as we know from his voyages, he was to travel around the world 3 times. If you go to Great Ayton today, on the village green, there's a sculpture of James Cook as a boy. And up on the North Rock Moors, a wonderful sandstone monument celebrating the man. And in 1755, at the age of 27, he'd had enough of moving colliers or moving coal in colliers from Newcastle down to London. And he signed on in London with the Royal Navy at the age of 27. But they obviously saw that the man had some skills, and he was a master's mate by July of the same year. A year later, he was already promoted to boatswain. And then the following year, he qualified as a master at Trinity House in Deptford. Now, master didn't mean you were in overall charge. It meant you could run a ship, you could navigate it, you could moor it, you could anchor it. There would still be a captain above you that would take charge. And then for the next 10 years, he made repeated voyages to Canada, he overwintered, and he charted Newfoundland. The earliest portrait we have of him is from 1759. So this will be just at the start of his trips to Canada. This is one you probably all have seen, 1775. This is just at the end of his second voyage, and this was painted by William Hodges. And he doesn't wear a full captain's uniform at this point because he hadn't been commissioned fully. And it's not until we come to this portrait by Nathaniel Price, 1776, that we see the captain in all his regalia, well established within the Admiralty. The son of a farm labourer has made it all the way to being a captain in the Royal Navy. Got to bring in a wee bit of his career and family life. His family life wasn't quite as we would perhaps accept it today. And I just want to point out for his career column that you see on my slide, there's a gentleman called Paul Capper who worked for the Captain Cook Society, or was a member of the Captain Cook Society, who drew up the anthology of Cook. It's extensive. I would certainly advise anyone to look at that website and go through a detailed life. The important parts are that in the first 4 years, he overwintered in Nova Scotia, and he met a surveyor called Samuel Holland. And Samuel Holland was an engineer for General Wolfe. And why was General Wolfe there? Well, General Wolfe was trying to take over Canada from the French, and there was something called the 7 Years' War. Now, at that time, he came back in 1762, and he married someone called Elizabeth Batts, and she was the daughter of a publican in London. He continued on with his sailing to and from the UK. Imagine every year you'd leave in April, sail to Newfoundland, do your work, and then sail home again in October, November. And it's on one of those trips he met a naturalist called Joseph Banks. And Joseph Banks will feature later in the story because he actually went on the first voyage with Cook on HMS Endeavour. 3 children were born in that period. You'll see James, 63, born in 1763, Nathaniel, 64, and then Elizabeth in 1767. Off he goes on his first voyage around the world, 1768 to 1771. Sadly, another son is born but dies a month later, and his daughter Elizabeth dies in April of 1771. The second voyage, which is the one we'll talk about tonight, with HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure, saw him leave in July of 1772. He just missed the birth of another son, George, who also sadly died in infancy in October. The third voyage, you can see they start just a year after the preceding one. He went off with Resolution and Discovery. And of course, we know now that Cook died on a beach in Hawaii on the 14th of February, 1779. This was a man who, I think, put career before family, but that was perhaps the time that he lived in. He was married to Elizabeth Batts for 17 years. They only had 4 years together, and she died in 1835 in 1793. The two children who were still alive actually predeceased the mother, so there are no descendants of Cook to this day, direct blood descendants. Now the ships, they were built as colliers. One was the Marquis of Granby, one was the Marquis of Rockingham. You can see the cost of them, and that's dependent on their size. And initially, the Admiralty called them both the Drake and the Rowley, respectively. But somebody in Parliament pointed out, we just signed a treaty to end the 7 Years' War, and Spain was one of these signatories. Maybe they don't want to be reminded of conquests in the past, evoked by the name Drake and Resolution. So let's call them Resolution and Adventure, not Drake and Raleigh. The thing to look at here is the refit cost of the Resolution, £6,500 for a ship that carries 118 people. The important thing to know is that Resolution was smaller than Cook's original ship, the Endeavour. She's 34 meters long. If any of you play cricket, think it's 1.5 times a cricket match, a pitch. It's less than a 50-meter swimming pool. These were not big ships. They were colliers known as Whitby Cats, and they were built in Whitby by a company called Fishburne. And what was special is they had a very broad flat bow, a square stern, a box body, because that gave you a deep hold, and they had a flat bottom, which meant you could run that ship onto a beach, it would stay upright, and you could work on it. This is actually a replica of HMS Endeavour with smaller than Cook ships. She was built in Australia. She sailed to the UK. And I believe there's also a steel version of Endeavour in Whitby Harbour today. So Resolution was refitted, and this was to accommodate this scientist, Joseph Banks, plus 15 of his servants and scientists. Well, by the time they put all the new addition on, the ship was now 1.2 meters deeper. And so somebody had a bright idea, well, that's fine, we'll just remove some ballast and she'll float higher. As you know, if a ship doesn't have enough ballast, she becomes unstable. And the pilot gave up at the Nore in the Thames estuary, and the lieutenant at the time said, an exceeding dangerous, unsafe ship. So what did they do? They removed all of that extra work and said the ship will be brought back to its original condition. And Joseph Banks, he thought that this was going to be his voyage and he would be in charge. At Sheerness, when he saw it, he swore and stamped upon the wharf like a madman. Joseph Banks was not going to go on that expedition. And I found a quote that said, Cook cursed the scientists and all science into the bargain. However, he did relent. He did have scientists on board. Now, the supernumeraries who were carried, well, we had to replace Joseph Banks. So they took on a German-English gentleman called Johann Reinhold Forster and his son George. But they could also take a servant. In Cape Town, they found a Swedish naturalist called Anders Sparman, who had studied under Linnaeus in Uppsala. And they took along an astronomer, William Wales. He was from the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, because the whole purpose of this voyage was one of navigation and checking out clocks. The landscape artist was William Hodges. The Venture only carried one astronomer, and that was William Bailey. Now, I should add that Forster Senior was not a pleasant man. He was reported to be a problem from every angle. By contrast, his son George was a talented artist, linguist, and scientist that had to live under the pressure of his father. And this resulted in controversy over the eventual publications of the reports of the second voyage in 1777, where Forster, as a civilian, tried to publish his report before the official reports of the Admiralty. It was not a happy time. Now, before we go on to longitude, time, and navigation, latitude was a positioning parameter that we could all estimate from the angle of the sun. We know that the sun moves with the seasons, and with that angle, you could estimate where you were, how far north or how far south. Longitude is a different beast, and it moves, of course, around the equator of our world. And about this time, the Royal Observatory in Greenwich had said, well, 0 degrees goes through Greenwich, and we have to calculate everything to that point. Until the 1714 First Longitude Act, they had used something called lunar distance to find out where the position of longitude was, distance to the moon. And there was also another method using the moons of Jupiter. I think it was the one called Io. And if on a clear night and you had a good calendar, you knew where those planets were, you could get an estimate of longitude. But the Royal Observatory said, if we can use accurate time, and we can carry an accurate time plot on a ship, was a £20,000 prize waiting for someone. 3 names you have to take from this: Harrison, who made the most successful plot, and it was called H4, Kendall, who was asked to copy H4, and Arnold, another watchmaker, who came into his own to make what was termed the first chronometer. He's said to have used the phrase for the first time. Arnold was asked to build 4 chronometers, and as a result, when Resolution sailed in 1772, she could carry Kendall's first copy, K1, Arnold's number 3, and the ship Adventure would carry Arnold's numbers 1 and 2. This was to be the ultimate test. As it turned out, K1 behaved extremely well, didn't lose too much time, but the Arnold clocks didn't do so well. And just so you know, these clocks were held in a case. They had 3 locks, so that 3 men had to be present to open them, to wind them up each day. If you're going to keep accurate time, you can't have everyone just playing with the clock as they feel like it, and maybe forgetting to wind it. Now, Harrison C clocks. There's his H1, 1735. There's his H2, just 4 years later. And there's H3. Now you're saying, well, how big are these? Well, roughly that's 68 centimeters across. All of them are big. They weigh about 40 kilos. This is H4, and you can see it had been shrunk nicely, because Harrison had got in touch with a man who could make small watches and pocket watches, and he was able to cram his new escape movements into something that is only 12 centimeters across. This was H4 that was accepted by the Admiralty in 1759. Kendall was the watchmaker who was asked to copy it, and this is the exact copy of H4, called K1. The dial is 102 millimeters across, so you can get an idea of size. It's about 1 inch thick, so it's quite a chunky little device. It was about 1.5 kilos. But look at the intricacy of the metalwork on that clock. And that kept accurate time for 3 years. Now, South Georgia, you'd seen it before. 1675, an Englishman called Antoine de la Roche. He had a French father, was on the ship that got blown off course in April, and it's said that he sheltered on the southern end of the island for 14 days. There's no original record. His notes were written up by a later Spanish author. 1756, Gregario Jerez, Spanish, in charge of a French ship, which was also hit by storms, sighted a small island, which they thought was Anankoff, which lies off the west coast of South Georgia, and then a larger island on or around the 30th of June or the 1st of July. And this was named Isla de San Pedro, the Isle of St. Peter, by the French hydrographer on board, Guyot, and that is the name that is commonly used today. I have to bring in a chap called Alexander Dalrymple at this point, because I'm afraid he's a Scotsman born in Edinburgh, of all places. He was a captain with the East India Company, and he was a Scottish geographer and the first hydrographer to the Admiralty later on in his career in 1795. Part of his work was to gather historical collections of voyages, and he published them in 2 volumes. One was all the Spanish transcriptions he could find, and the other was all the Dutch ones. These were the people who were traveling around the world at the time, and he wanted to collate them together. And as a result, he then decided that there is a great continent called Terra Australis Incognita down there that we need to find. And there's a gulf called the Gulf of San Sebastian. And later, in 1772, he said, there's going to be a great big island called Isla Grande. It's in the South Atlantic. It's 45 degrees south. It's just north of the southern continent. This was published, unfortunately, in 1775. By the time Cook had just come back and said, no, we didn't find the southern continent. It didn't hold Alexander Dalrymple back. As you see, he became the first hydrographer to the Admiralty, and that continued on. He had a theory, and he just got it slightly wrong. Resolution and Adventure sailed together from Plymouth in 1772. They are the first ships to cross the Antarctic Circle, actually 252 years ago today. And then the interesting thing about those 2 ships are that they were supposed to stay together, and they got separated twice. And they got separated twice in and around New Zealand, shown Queen Charlotte Sound on the map there. And there was a bit of, I don't know, difference of opinion as to how the order should be followed. Anyway, in the first separation, they did meet up again, and then they sailed away together on the 17th September. But on the second separation, in October of 1773, they did not meet up again. Adventure arrived back at Queen Charlotte Sound 4 days after Resolution had left. Resolution was then going back up into the Pacific Islands. Adventure then stayed to restore and fix the ship. And there was an incident in Ship Cove where many of the ship's crew were sadly killed, and many of the local mariners were also killed. It was an unpleasant situation, and Captain Tobias Furneaux then reckoned it was time to head for home. We'll see him on the next map. But another thing that Resolution achieved was she got the furthest south of 71 degrees 10 minutes south in 1774, and that remained until Captain James Weber sailed further south in 1828. Now, here are the tracks of the 2 ships. This is from the work by Beaglehole, 1969. Look at the blue line, the blue arrows. There's Adventure leaving New Zealand. She sails eastwards, well south of Cape Horn. She just misses South Georgia. She makes it to Cape Town in April 1775. A whole year later, Resolution is hugging the coast of Cape Horn, comes round Staten Island at the eastern side, and heads eastwards. And lo and behold, comes across South Georgia. They didn't know it was there. They came across it. They were looking for the Terra Australis Incognita and the Great Southern Continent. Resolution then sailed south again, and lo and behold, came across the South Sandwich Islands before returning to Cape Town a year after the adventure. How was the island sighted? Well, I've had to précis how it was written because it's very flowery language in these reports. But on the 14th of January 1775, they sighted what they thought was an island of ice, and they weren't sure. But by 2 p.m., they said, it's definitely land, it's the Willis Islands. They'd sail offshore each night. They didn't land at this point. They had to keep away from land. They didn't know, was it an island or was it a continent? On Tuesday the 17th, they'd sailed back into land, and eventually they landed when they saw an inlet. And Cook states in his report, I landed in 3 different places, displayed our colours, took possession in His Majesty's name under a discharge of arms. They returned to the ship. They had only been on the island for 5 hours. That's because they didn't know, was this an island at this time, or was this the very continent? So you better sail on. We know today that 3 days later, after Cooper Island and the southern coast of South Georgia, the coast turns towards the southwest and they came to Cape Disappointment. The great continent was no more than an island 70 leagues in circuit, which I call Isle of Georgia after the king at the time, George III. If you come across the Willis Islands, this is what they look like. It's quite foreboding, it's quite steep, and there are always rocks around it. You have to be careful. Possession Bay, which was caught by Hodges, and it's now been engraved, and this is the plate that you often see of the island. The nearest I could get to it was this, but I think that does capture the weather of South Georgia. It can be sunny in one part and blowing a hoolie in the other as you sail in towards the land. Of course, I wanted to find out what the geologist was thinking when he landed for his 5 hours. And this is from Foster's report, that most unpleasant land. He didn't say much. He said it had high steep rocks. It was a heavy ironstone. It's a grey slate. It crumbles in shingle, and it has horizontal strata. That's all that was recorded. But he did say there were no other minerals, the whole country being useless and frightfully barren in every respect. And he went on to say, to live here fills the whole soul with horror and despair. His language was a bit flowery. Sailing further south, Hodges recorded these jagged peaks. And of course, I think a lot of us would think this is just artistic license. It's not really that steep. But in fact, it is. The southern part of South Georgia has very rugged peaks. This is the original chart. What you have to note is that south is uppermost on this chart, north is down. There's South Georgia in the bottom right-hand corner. There's Sandwich Land, the South Sandwich Islands in the top left. And there's the route of the ship shown by the black arrows. If we blow it up a little bit, you'll see there's the island of Georgia. Remember, north is down, south is up. So let's flip it. And that northeastern coastline is the one that I think we all know. It's got the indentations. And Cook, who didn't sail up that southwestern flat coast, only drew in what he could see. He just said, well, it's a coastline that extends, but I don't know its features. He came in at the Willis Islands. There's Possession Bay. He rounded Cooper Island. And he went round Cape Disappointment and said, it's an island, we're going. So off they went to the Clark Rocks, and then they went to the South Sandwich Islands afterwards. let's jump 181 years. Now, you may think that's a funny number of years to jump. The next most accurate map was the one made in the 50s by the South Georgia surveys led by Duncan Carse. Now, it's not to say there hadn't been maps made since Cook's map and this one of 1958. The whalers all made maps. Every expedition that went to South Georgia made a map, but there was no one single scale. There was no unified surveying method. All were sort of good in their own rights, but not that good. But we know that they were good enough to help Shackleton and his men get across from King Hawthorne Bay to Stromness, at least. So now we jump to the 50s. This is the map that many of us who worked from the British Antarctic Survey in the 70s would use. This was our map of South Georgia at 1 to 200,000 scale. Now, the South Georgia surveys were led by a man called Duncan Carse. There were 3 survey years in all. And the important thing is that they carried a geologist with them, and he was called Alec Trendle. And he was the man that set the score for us all to follow when we joined BAS in the period from 1966 to 1977. He wrote 2 seminal volumes that was the start of geology in the island. And of course, BAS only came into being, the British Antarctic Survey came into being in 1962. Before that, it was called the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey. And so from the period of 1966 to 1977, BAS put 10 geologists, plus 2 that were in transit to Howell Bay. They stopped off in South Georgia to do some field work at that time. If you can get hold of Alec Trendle's book, it's well worth reading. Here's the man. He looks like a geologist. He's rough. Definitely a good man to have with you. How do we spend our field seasons? You'd often spend 6 weeks sailing down to South Georgia. You'd have maybe 23 weeks in the field, moved 6 times, had 10 camps, spent 5 weeks sailing home. But I think the important thing to differentiate then and now, we had a daily radio schedule with the base at King Edward Point. You had 100 words a month read out over the telex or by radio. You maybe got post on the ship moves, and you had the BBC Weather Service to listen to. The ship I went down on both times was the John Biscoe, 1,500 tons. And of course, the weather wasn't always good. We did have some rough seas, and especially when they came over that low foredeck, we started to worry from time to time. Getting into the field, we'd often be dropped by these little rubber boats called Geminis. I think other expeditions call them Zodiacs. And here we see one of my companions, Dave Burkett, about to get into the Gemini with the boat driver and take us into the Broger Glacier on the southern side of the island. If you were very lucky, there'd be a helicopter around from HMS Endurance, but it wasn't the most efficient way to be moved because they couldn't carry so much as you want to get a camp put in quickly. Now, Cook had learned to make maps in Newfoundland and Canada. He was taught plane tabling. Lo and behold, when Scott's men went down, they used plane tabling. And guess what we used in the 70s? Yes, to make a bigger scale map, we were still using plane tables to make our maps at 1 to 10,000. That meant we had to expand the existing map from 1 to 200,000, 20 times down to give us a map for detailed geology. Camping in the field was luxurious if you had one of these big tents. It's an 8-foot square pyramid. It's double walled. It's very comfortable. It's very warm. When it was less luxurious, you were at a depot camp, or you were carrying this up the glacier yourself or on the back of a sledge. And here we are up on the Solomon Glacier You can see from Brian's story sitting there, the tent wasn't much higher than him. It was quite cramped. It was good for 2 or 3 days. The areas I worked in my 2 seasons, in 1974, it was the southern end of the island. In 76, up the southwestern coast, and fill in some geology on Annipoff Island off to the west, and then fill in the Moraine Fjord area just in central South Georgia. This is what our party looked like. 3 geologists and 1 general assistant on this trip. It's Mike Bell with a rope round him and the goggles, Dave Orchard, our general assistant next, myself and Brian Story. And that's Douglas Crag in the background, which overlooks the southern end of the island. We wanted to do a Victorian pose to show it how we really were. Now, come the 200th anniversary, we were down the south end of the island in a place called Small Cove. And we had 2 camps because we could cover geology better if we had 2 men on the left side of the island in blue and the other 2 in the middle camp in red on the right. It made sense, but we wanted to get together from time to time. So when you look at the details of Small Cove in the satellite image, there was Brian and Dave in the west. We were on the right, but you can see from this bay that it would be a long walk all the way up around that bay and then back down again, then cross that glacier to meet these gaps. We noticed there was a moraine, and the moraine is the end of the glacier that's pushed its debris out into a bay, and at low tide that moraine was quite shallow, so we could perhaps walk over it. So this is how we spent the 200th anniversary. We were wading across a very shallow moraine in Small Cove to go and meet our friends on the other side of the bay. Stimulating, very good for the circulation, but wonderful to do in a place like Small Cove, which has some fantastic scenery. Now, in my second season, I was with Dave Burkett. Here he is on the left, repairing a crampon which had broken. And there's myself, clad in our wonderful Vental anorak gear that we were given by the British Antarctic Survey. Wonderful stuff to wear. Once it got wet, it was totally windproof. Really good. So where was I on the 202nd anniversary? I was with Dave up on the Spencer Glacier in a small pup tent, sampling rocks that lie along that glacier down to the southeast. Now, it's funny, when I was coming to do the work in this map, I realized that 3 geologists of South Georgia almost came to sticky ends within this map area. That geologist, Alec Trendle, had fallen into a bergschrund in January of 1952 and had to be rescued by the other members of his party and survived. In February 76, Brian Story and Dave Burkett were on a beach outside the Gila Glacier when a giant wave took their camp away, a penguin rookery away, and all Brian's rock samples. So that meant the reason for me coming back to this area was I would try and resample the rocks that Brian had lost. But then in December 76, on a preliminary sledging journey with Dave Burkett, I happened to fall into a crevasse. And this was not a good thing to do. I lost my snowshoes at the time as I fell through the snow bridge. I lost my ice axe. And we had to curtail that sledging journey. But hey, all 3 of us survived. This is how we sledged inland in those days. It was a small, light sledge. We could carry food and equipment for maybe 10 days. It meant we could get away from the coast and also take our tent with us so we could camp each night. We used sledge traces to pull the sledge. In this case, you can see there's one at either end, because that means we were in crevasse country and it was safer to travel with. So having lost my snowshoes and my ice axe, we had to call in the Navy to come and save us. And in December of 1976, HMS Endurance was spending Christmas at King Edward Point, and she flew across a helicopter with just the equipment we need: snowshoes, replacement ice axes, and we were given some post. So we had done some other work over Christmas, and then come January, we had to look back up the Spencer Glacier and decide where is it we were going to go. Just to orientate you to the map we saw earlier, there on the left, you'll see where Alec Trendle had fallen into his bergschrund. Somewhere in among these crevasses, I had had my encounter. And way up here, I call it Nunatak 1461, but it was 4792 on the old map. And we had to get up to there, sampling all those Nunataks along the side of the glacier on the way. And just for final orientation, the two big hills up there, with mountains, I should say, Mount Patterson, 2196 meters, and Mount Bourne. Now, the Spencer Glacier is very, very long. You don't want to be stuck out exposed on the surface. So every day we would dig a hole and put our tent into it, build a snow wall around it, with our sledge at one end and our snowshoes, in case the wind got up, because if the wind got up, our tent and us would end up being blown down the glacier. This is Mount Cling off to the upper right, and in the far left is Mount Paget, but it looks smaller because it's further away from us towards the northwest. There we are in one of our snow holes. I'm a happy geologist. I've got bags of rocks, and the sun is shining. What more could you want? But we now have to celebrate the 202nd anniversary of being on Cook's Island. So what did I do for the 202nd anniversary? Well, it just so happens I had a clean vest. So I thought it's time to change vest. I'm not going to pass comment on what Dave Burkett was wearing, but it did not come out of the packet that morning, that's for sure. Now, you might be thinking that all we did was we went down and we sledged about and had a great time, but we actually did collect geological samples, and we did put them on a map. But I have to take you back to 1959 because this is Kendall's map. And he started putting together the regional geology of the island that we know, and he started naming the formation types. What you can see straight away is it's all in black and white, and things have changed since 1959. Plus, of course, we've had 10 geologists working every year. Not every year, and most years between 1966 and 1977 to try and put more detail into the picture. This is the latest geology map of South Georgia, 2011, put together by a gentleman called Mike Curtis. You immediately see at the start, there's colour. Way, that's got to be good. But the important thing is there are different colours. And those different colours are now put in a field relationship to each other. So they're side by side, and they have a meaning as to where they are positioned. And the other important thing is we have now put them into an age sequence. You can see down the left-hand side, pre-Jurassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. And I think you can see from this map that the southern part of the island is a little bit more complicated. The bulk of the island is Cumberland Bay Formation, sandstones and schists, but it is quite a thick sequence of units. But the important part that gives us the information about how this island came to be is in the second part. It's one thing mapping geology, you then have to put it into what we call a plate tectonic model. South Georgia sits right down on the edge of the Scotia Sea Plate. It abuts onto the South American Plate, which in turn abuts onto the Pacific Plate. That Pacific Plate is moving from left to right against the Cordillera of the Southern Andes, which is the South American Plate. And remember, Chile and the whole of the western coast of the Andes has volcanoes. When we put some of the South Georgia formations into the same picture, there's that Pacific Plate coming from the west and going down under the South American Plate, with a result that forms volcanism, which is what's called the Ancon Island Formation lying off western South Georgia. And behind it's what's called the Backup Basin, which is floored by the Larsen Harbor complex that I worked on in the 70s. And adjacent to that, another part of the old continent known as the Geology Fieldwork complex, worked on by Brian Story. And the sedimentary infill of the Cumberland Bay and Sandy Mountain formations fill that basin that the Larsen Harbor complex had formed. The other thing about South Georgia is it was 1,500 kilometers further west when it was formed. It was adjacent to Terre del Fuego. Now, if you can remember all of that, I'll send you the quiz later. But thank you for listening. Tell a lie, I've jumped the gun. I forgot to say, what about Cook's legacy? Well, here's his map, and it's in the right orientation. North is up. So where do you think he is in longitude and latitude compared to the present satellite position of South Georgia today? Only look at the northeastern coast rather than the southwestern coast of the present-day island, because Cook didn't map that southwestern coast. Adrian Fox, who's a member of the South Georgia Association Committee, helped me put this map together. So the lats and longs and position of that island are correct. Captain Cook, with his plots, managed to put South Georgia on the map and in the right position. And that, I have to say, is the end of my talk. Happy 250th anniversary. And I'm very sorry for the yellow lines. I don't know if you can see yellow lines on your pictures, but I can see them on mine, and I'm not going to touch them. So I'll hand back to you, Pat.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Really good. Thanks very much, Bruce. That was very well entertaining. For those of us who've used sledges and worn Ventile, I'm sure there are many here that's rekindled some happy memories. Amazing little bit of mapping at the end, just showing how accurate Cook had got the place. That's really good, and really nice to hear the history of the geology of the place. If you're lucky enough to tour around, you'll know that the southern end is a lot spikier than the rest, and it's the work that people like yourself have done, finding out why, that brings a place to life. I'm just going to have a look through to see if we've got any questions. Yeah, there's only one really. Would there have been any reason why he didn't traverse around the entire island? So yeah, the question there from Joe. Bruce, would you like to tell us why Cook didn't go all the way around?
Well, I think at that time, when he first approached South Georgia, he didn't know if he'd come to a continent or an island. And I think the search was still on for a continent. So as soon as he realized it was an island, he was going to say, no, I'm still going looking for the continent. It's there somewhere. Plus, as a sailor, he would know that the prevailing winds on South Georgia come from the southwest. And that southwest coastline, if you read the Antarctic Pilot, it says this coastline is to be avoided by sailing ships. If he got caught on that shore, that ship would not have survived. So part of it was safety, but part of it was he knew he hadn't found the continent and he was still looking for it.
Brilliant. Oh, well, That's a very good explanation. Okay, we've got one last question, quite an interesting one from Julian, which is, what did you say in your 100-word telexes?
When I look back at those telexes, because I still have them, my parents received them. It was very mundane stuff. What would we say? We couldn't say the food was awful. I hate my tent companion. You know, he snores at night. We just did as all explorers do. Everything's fine. It's fantastic. How are you?
Yeah, you're quite right.
Publishing them.
Yeah, you don't want to send all your whinges and gripes back home. You've got to pretend you're having an amazing time, which, well, it really looked as though you were up on the glaciers. I had the pleasure of traversing up the Spencerley Glacier many years ago, over 25 years ago. And I also nearly fell down a hole there, so quite a lurky area. Grand. Yeah, so I think that's about it. So I'd just like to say a quick thank you to everybody for coming along, and particularly to Sarah G, who did all the setting up of the online ticketing system, which isn't very often recognised. But yeah, great job, Sarah, and thank you very, very much, Bruce. And yeah, I'll say good night to everyone, and thanks all for coming along. And we look forward to seeing you with the South Georgia Association's next event later on in the year. I'll say cheerio.
Thank you
very much. Goodbye.
Bruce.